At 6:47 a.m. on March 14, 1944, Private First Class Rodrigo Totoy Manalang of the marking guerrillas crouched at the western ridgeline of Mount Banahaw, Quezon Province, watching 43 Imperial Japanese soldiers advance in tight column formation along the Nagaland Trail, their lead element 91 meters from his position, as morning mist hung in silver curtains from the canopy above. His weapon, 9 days in the making, was not a gun or grenade, but 17 hand-carved caribou horn resonators, buried at precise intervals along a 200-meter stretch of trail and connected by vine string to a single trigger pin anchored beneath a rotting banyan root. His nearest allies, a 6-man covering element under Corporal Aurelio Santos, were 230 meters to the east, too far to hear, too far to help. In the next 4 minutes and 30 seconds, 42 of those 43 soldiers would be dead, incapacitated, or retreating in the wrong direction. War does not always go to the soldier with the highest rank or the finest credentials. Sometimes it belongs entirely to the man no one believed. What historians and former guerrilla officers would later describe in declassified 1947 Army intelligence summaries as an improvised acoustic deception system of unexpected lethality was, on that morning, called nothing more dignified than Totoy's noise traps, and every officer above him had ordered him to abandon them. Only one Japanese soldier made it back to the garrison at Santa Cruz that afternoon. He was incoherent. He could not explain what had killed his unit. He told his garrison commander only that the jungle had spoken, and then the jungle had killed them. The records of the marking guerrillas, retrieved from a wax-sealed container buried beneath the floorboards of a schoolhouse in Luspa, Tucson in 1962, contain 14 pages of formal documentation on what happened on that ridgeline. What follows is drawn from those pages, from post-war American intelligence assessments, and from the testimony of 3 men who survived the morning of March 14th and lived long enough to describe it. This is that story. Before we dive in, I want to know, where are you listening to this story from? Drop your city or country in the comments right now, and let's see which corner of the world has the most war legend fans. Don't just scroll. Type it out. Your comment might get featured in the next story. Rodrigo Manalang was 24 years old in 1944. He was born in the barrio of San Isidro in the lowland interior of Laguna Province, the third son of a schoolteacher and a carabao herder, and he grew to 5 feet 4 inches, lean from years of field labor and months of jungle living. He had no formal military training beyond the 2-week orientation that the Philippine Commonwealth Army had provided to rural conscripts in the chaotic months of late 1941, a period so underfunded and so rushed that many men, including Manalang, never received a rifle of their own during basic instruction. He had learned to hold one by watching others. He entered the resistance in late 1922, drawn in through the same network of burial-level connections that had recruited most of the marking guerrilla unit. A combination of old-school friendships, provincial loyalty, and a specific, personal hatred of what the occupation had done to the farms and families around him. He was not, by any observable standard at the time of his recruitment, a soldier of distinction. He was assigned immediately to the role of supply runner, the man who moved food, medicine, ammunition, and intelligence documents across jungle paths between dispersed units under cover of darkness alone. It was the lowest profile assignment in the resistance structure. It went to men considered too unimposing, too junior, or simply too unproven to command a combat element. Lieutenant Ernesto Villanueva, his commanding officer, recorded his assessment of Manalang in his field notes with characteristic brevity, reliable in logistics, non-commissioned temperament, no apparent tactical aptitude. That assessment would later be circled in red ink by an American intelligence analyst in 1947. And annotated with a single word, wrong. What Villanueva had failed to observe, what every officer above Manalang had failed to observe, was that the supply runner was one of the most precise listeners ever to move through the Philippine resistance jungle. It was not a gift, so much as a necessity. Manalang moved at night. He moved alone. He could not afford to be heard, which meant he had spent 18 months learning with methodical and obsessive attention how sound behaved in dense tropical vegetation. You learn that sound traveled differently through wet kogon grass than through dry bamboo stands. He learned that the drainage ravines of Mount Banahaw acted as acoustic channels, amplifying and directing noise in ways that open ground did not. He learned that the jungle, under the right conditions, was not merely cover, it was an instrument. The discovery that changed everything came on a night in September 1943 when Manalang, sheltering from rain inside a hollow basalt formation, discovered that a partially buried carabao horn left by a farmer at the trail's edge was producing a low, directional resonant tone as wind moved through the surrounding vegetation and varied the pressure along the vine cord still tied to its base. The tone was quiet, but it was directional. It clearly appeared to originate from a point 30 meters distant, in the direction of the ravine wall. Manalang sat in the dark and listened to it for 40 minutes, moving his head to track the apparent source. He was not hearing music, he was hearing a weapon. He also noted something that no officer trained in Western military doctrine had ever considered operationally relevant, that Japanese patrols, when moving through unfamiliar jungle terrain, reflexively oriented toward lateral sound cues, their 3 o'clock and 9 o'clock flanks, rather than toward their 12 o'clock axis of advance. It was a consistent behavioral pattern he had observed across 11 separate scouting events, documented in the margins of a salvaged school exercise book with diagrams and compass bearings. No commanding officer he had reported it to had acted on the information, so Manalang had decided to act on it himself. He began carving the resonators in early 1943. He produced 17 of them over 14 months, each carved from carabao horns salvaged from barrio farms. He tested them individually along abandoned carabao paths, adjusting burial angles and vine string tension to refine the directional output. When he first demonstrated the concept to Villanueva in November 1943, Villanueva watched 30 seconds of the demonstration and dismissed him with a wave. "We are fighting a war, Manalang, not making music." Manalang wrapped the horns in dried banana leaves and carried them in a supply pack anyway, alongside rice cakes and spare detonator wire. He told no one else about them, not until the morning of March 12, 1944, when the situation left him no other option. By March 1944, the Philippine resistance on Luzon had endured 2.5 years of Japanese occupation, a grinding, asymmetric campaign conducted not from fixed positions or fortified lines, but from the jungle's interior, where malaria, hunger, and the constant threat of informants killed guerrillas at a rate that sometimes exceeded combat losses. The romance of the resistance, as it would later be written about in post-war histories, bore little resemblance to its daily reality. Unwashed men and women in rain-soaked shelters, eating camote and river fish, managing wounds with improvised compresses, transmitting coded messages on radio equipment that failed weakly, and making do. The Japanese Imperial Army's 14th Army, under the overall command of General Shigenori Kuroda, headquartered in Manila, had established a network of garrisons across the central Luzon plain and through the provinces of Laguna and Quezon. These were not passive occupation forces. They were actively hunting. The Shishosakusen, clearing operations, had become the primary tactical instrument of the Japanese counter-guerrilla campaign by late 1943. Company-strength elements entering known or suspected guerrilla terrain, establishing blocking positions, and sweeping back along trail corridors to compress and destroy any resistance elements caught between the advance and the block. The garrison at Santa Cruz, Laguna, approximately 340 men strong in early 1944, reinforced with a light machine gun section and 2 70mm infantry guns, had identified the Nagcarlan corridor as a primary guerrilla logistics route. They were correct. The corridor, a network of jungle trails connecting the southern Laguna lowlands to the slopes of Mount Banahaw in Quezon Province, was the principal pathway by which the marking guerrillas moved the submarine-delivered supply caches from the coast into the interior resistance networks. American submarines had been landing materials along the Quezon coastline since mid-1943, medicine, radio components, intelligence documents, ammunition, and without the Nagcarlan corridor, those materials could not reach the fighters who needed them. The specific geography of the corridor was its defining tactical problem. Approximately 220 meters along the central trail, the path narrowed to 4 meters in width, compressed between a basalt outcropping on its eastern side and a steep drainage ravine on its western flank. This was the funnel. Any unit caught inside the funnel during a Japanese clearing sweep had limited options: advance toward the blocking element, retreat toward the sweep element, or attempt to climb the outcropping under fire. A climb that took a fit. Unencumbered man, a minimum of 8 minutes. For men carrying supply packs, it was not a viable option at all. The Japanese had learned this. The clearing operations targeting the Nagcarlan corridor were designed to exploit it. The patrols entered from the south, advanced through the funnel, and turned the funnel's constrictive geography from a defensive asset into a killing ground. The tactic had produced results before Manilang's unit inherited the corridor. In December 1943, a Japanese clearing operation along the adjacent Lupin Ridge had killed 9 guerrillas from the Hunter's ROTC unit and destroyed a supply cache valued in terms of its operational irreplaceability at weeks of submarine risk. In January 1944, a second operation had captured 3 members of a marking courier cell, forcing a complete restructuring of the northern Quezon communication network. Morale in the guerrilla command structure was not broken, but it was fractured in the specific way that sustained operational setbacks. Fracture morale, the slow erosion of the belief that the situation could be controlled. What compounded the pressure in March 1944 was a specific, critical shortage. A quinine cache delivered by submarine in late February had been sitting at a coastal dead drop point for 17 days, inaccessible because every attempt to move it through the corridor had been blocked by Japanese patrol presence. 3 fighters inside the mountain shelter were in advanced stages of malaria. 1 had been unable to walk for 4 days. The other 2 were deteriorating. Without quinine, the unit's medical reality was simple and brutal. The 3 men would likely die, and others would follow. Lieutenant Villanueva understood this. He also understood that his combat-capable strength was 11 men, armed with 2 functioning rifles with adequate ammunition, 3 shotguns, and a collection of bolo knives and improvised grenades. Against a 40-man Japanese patrol column equipped with Type 99 rifles and a Type 96 light machine gun, a direct engagement inside the funnel was not a tactical option. It was a description of collective suicide. The standing order for the Nakarlan corridor was explicit and had been ratified by the broader marking command structure: no engagement in the funnel zone. When a Japanese patrol entered, the guerrilla unit fell back to secondary interior positions, ceded the corridor, and waited. The problem was that waiting was no longer something the unit could afford to do. The pressure crystallized in the first week of March. On March 2nd, Sergeant Benigno Ocampo led a 4-man team in an attempt to move the quinine cache through the corridor during what reconnaissance suggested would be a gap between Japanese patrol schedules. The team was 200 meters into the funnel when they encountered a static observation post, a 2-man fighting position dug into the base of the outcropping, invisible from the trail, not indicated in any prior intelligence report. Ocampo's team retreated without making contact, losing their approach window and nearly losing 1 man to a fall in the drainage ravine. The observation post was a new development. It meant that the Japanese were now watching the corridor between scheduled patrols. Evasion was no longer simply a matter of timing the gaps between sweeps. On March 6th, Private Domingo Reyes, the unit's most combat-experienced man, a former Philippine constabulary corporal with 3 years of pre-war service, proposed eliminating the observation post with a direct pre-dawn assault using the unit's remaining bolo grenades. Villanueva authorized the attempt. Reyes and 2 others moved into position after midnight on March 7th. 1 grenade was a dud. The second detonated early, wounding Reyes in the left hand and triggering an alert at the post before the assault closed the distance. Both Japanese soldiers in the post escaped toward the garrison. By dawn on March 8th, it was clear that the Santa Cruz garrison now knew the guerrillas had attempted to clear the observation post. A full response was imminent. It came on March 10th, a 37-man patrol entering the funnel from the south, conducting a methodical 4-hour sweep of both sides of the trail. They found 2 hidden supply caches, dried rice, and a radio battery. They found the positions from which Reyes had launched his grenade assault. They found brute prints, disturbed vegetation, and the evidence of prolonged human presence along the eastern rim of the outcropping. They photographed or sketched what they found. The guerrilla unit, watching from distance, could see a soldier making notations in a field book and withdrew at 2 p.m. A second patrol, 43 men this time, was dispatched to the corridor 4 days later. Between March 10th and March 13th, the atmosphere inside the guerrilla shelter had moved past demoralized into something quieter and more dangerous, resigned. The malaria patients were worsening. Corporal Santos, in a conversation later described to the Marking Intelligence section, told a fellow fighter that he did not believe the unit could remain operationally viable in the Nagralan zone past the end of the month. There was open discussion, not mutiny, but the corridor before it, about abandoning the approach entirely and attempting to reroute supply movement through the coastal path, a longer and considerably more exposed route that would triple the risk to every courier who used it. It was against this background that Rodrigo Manalang, on the evening of March 12th, unrolled his exercise book on the floor of the shelter in front of Lieutenant Villanueva for the second time. Villanueva was not an unkind man. He was an exhausted one. 14 months in the field had worn the professional edges off his earlier certainties. He looked at the diagrams, the burial angle specifications, the vine string tension measurements, the annotated directional arrows showing projected sound propagation, the columns of patrol behavioral observations. And he did not wave his hand this time. He read. When he finished, he said, "What happens if the Japanese find the devices before the patrol enters the funnel?" Manalang said, "They will look like farmers' horns, sir. They have looked like farmers' horns for 14 months. Villanueva said, "And if the patrol does not break in the direction you expect?" Manalang opened the exercise book to a page near the back 11, documented observations of Japanese patrol behavior, each with a compass bearing, a time, and a notation on lateral orientation response. He set the book in front of his commanding officer and waited. There was a long silence. Villanueva looked at the 3 sick men on their mats in the shelter's corner. He looked at the empty space on the shelf where the radio battery had been before the patrol took it. He looked at Manalang. He said, "I am not ordering this. If you choose to set the devices tonight, that is your decision as an individual. If it fails, I cannot protect you from what follows." Manalang nodded, repacked his exercise book, lifted his supply pack, and walked into the dark jungle alone. He worked from 9:30 p.m. on March 12th through 4 a.m. on March 13th, 6.5 hours of near-silent labor in near-complete darkness, guided by slivers of filtered moonlight and by the muscle memory of objects he had handled so many times he could have assembled them blindfolded. The 17 Carabao horn resonators came out of their banana leaf wrapping one by one, each cleaned and inspected by touch. Manalang had memorized their placement sequence weeks before. 9 devices on the eastern side of the trail, 7 on the western side, and 1, the master resonator, the largest horn he had carved, with the widest bell and the deepest tonal range, buried directly beneath the trail's surface at the precise midpoint of the 200-meter funnel. Each device went into a pre-excavated hole dug the previous night during a preliminary scouting pass, angled between 22 and 35 degrees from vertical depending on local terrain and vegetation density. Angles he had refined over months of field testing to optimize each horn's directional throw. Each resonator was then connected by a section of dried vine string to the next device in the network, and the network as a whole connected to a single trigger assembly at the northern end, notched hardwood lever anchored beneath the banyan root, weighted with a smooth river stone precisely calibrated so that a clean pull on the master string would release all 17 triggers in a staggered 2-second left-to-right sequence. The trigger line itself, 38 meters of line string, ran from the lever low along the base of the outcropping where it would be concealed under ground cover to a position behind a dense cluster of staghorn fern approximately 40 meters west of the trail. From that position, Manalang would have both cover and a direct sight line to the midpoint marker he had identified, a pale limestone stone visible at the western trail edge, exactly where the master resonator lay buried. He tested the trigger assembly twice with dry runs, adjusting the stone weight once by replacing it with a slightly heavier river rock he found in the drainage channel. He checked every vine string connection for tension and integrity, by 49 string connection for tension and integrity. By 40 a.m. on March 13th, the resonator network was in place and ready. He spent the remaining darkness on the second component of his plan. The component he had never shown Villanueva, had never shown anyone, because he had not needed to justify it to anyone but himself. At 3 points along the eastern side of the funnel, spaced approximately 55 meters apart, positioned at the most likely lateral breakpoints for a column that had been driven east by the resonators, he set single-trigger bamboo spring traps. Each was armed with a sharpened, fire-hardened bamboo stake, driven by a split hardwood spring with tension sufficient, by his estimation, to drive the stake through clothing and into the torso of an adult man at a range of approximately 1 meter. Manalang had built dozens of these devices in his years as a supply runner, testing different gauge bamboo in different spring tensions until he understood their mechanical range of effect precisely. These 3 were the most powerful he had ever constructed. He oriented each trap toward the trail, at the height at which a man moving quickly through undergrowth would be most likely to break the trigger vine. He finished at 4:44 a.m. He moved to his observation position behind the fern cluster. He ate 1 rice cake. He drank half his canteen. He lay flat on the damp earth. in a position that gave him a clear view of the pale limestone marker, and waited. At 5:15 a.m., he heard the first sound from the direction of Santa Cruz, the low, rhythmic crunch of military boots on packed laterite soil. Still more than a kilometer away, carrying clearly in the pre-dawn stillness with the particular character of sound that meant formation movement. Too many footsteps for their cadered as sound that meant formation movement. Too many footsteps for their cadences to be fully synchronized. Too dense in spacing to be casual. He did not move. At 6:31 a.m., the lead element of the Japanese patrol appeared at the southern entrance to the funnel. Madaling counted them as they entered, 43 men, column formation, rifles at the low carry. The machine gun team. 4 men, a Type 96 light machine gun on its bipod, a folded tripod, a canvas ammunition pack, was positioned 5th and 6th from the front of the column. He let them come. The lead element reached the pale limestone marker at 6:47 a.m. Manaling's vine trigger string was in his right hand. He could feel the precise amount of slack remaining before the lever released. A physical sensation he had calibrated so carefully over the previous weeks that it was as familiar as the handle of a tool. He was watching the machine gun team, not the lead soldiers. The machine gun was the element that would determine whether everything that followed was a guerrilla victory or a catastrophe. If the Type 96 was deployed on its tripod before the resonators created their directional effect, the situation would become a conventional firefight, and conventional was a fight his 11-man unit could not survive. He watched the machine gun team cross the pale stone. He gave them 2 more full paces. Then he pulled the string. The sound the Japanese patrol heard was not a gunshot. It was not the detonation of a grenade, not the crack of a bolo, not any acoustic signature that 43 trained soldiers could match to a known threat in the time available. What they heard, what erupted from the ground around them along 200 meters of compressed jungle trail, was the simultaneous release of 17 buried resonators firing in a staggered left-to-right sequence, each producing a low bass-frequency directional tone that propagated laterally through the saturated soil and vegetation of the funnel wall. The 2-second sequence created an acoustic compression that the human auditory system, under conditions of extreme stress, interpreted not as a mechanical device but as movement, large, multi-directional, close-range movement pressing in from both sides simultaneously. To the 43 men inside the funnel, the sound came from their right, then from their left, from a different point, then from their right again, further back, then from somewhere behind the rear element, near the southern entrance, then from ahead, north, in the direction they had been advancing. The sequence was 2 seconds in clock time. In the perception of men whose adrenal systems had just discharged at maximum rate into already stressed bodies, it was considerably longer. The front 3 soldiers went flat to the ground without orders, the involuntary combat prone that training installs but cannot fully override when an unknown threat registers simultaneously from multiple directions. The machine gun team, 4th and 5th from the front, went flat with them. The bipod on the Type 96 hit the trail mud with a metallic clang that rang through the funnel. The column behind them compressed. A physical compression, men pushing into the backs of the men who had stopped, creating a mass of bodies in a corridor 4 meters wide, unable to see past the men in front, unable to hear orders clearly over the sound of their own breathing and the echo of the resonator still fading from the undergrowth. The column commander, Manalang, could see his rank tabs clearly from his firm position. A first lieutenant, Shu He, young, standing at the 8th position in the column, began shouting orders into the compressed formation. Manalang did not speak Japanese fluently, but 18 months of close proximity jungle scouting had given him functional recognition of field commands. The lieutenant was shouting "Mijiri, right," and sweeping his arm toward the eastern side of the funnel, toward the outcropping, toward the direction from which the first and strongest tonal impression had appeared to originate. The first 6 soldiers in the column rose from prone and moved east off the trail into the undergrowth beneath the outcropping. They moved in exactly the direction Manaling had documented in 11 observation entries in his exercise book. The first bamboo spring trap triggered at 6:11:48 a.m. The stake entered the leading soldier through the lower left abdomen at the precise angle the device had been engineered to deliver. The sound of the impact, the wet, mechanical snap of the spring releasing, followed immediately by the sound of a man falling heavily through undergrowth, reached Manalang before the screaming did. The screaming started a half-second later, and it was the particular register of a man impaled by a fixed object in an environment where no one can reach him, high, sustained, and without any tactical component. It was not a wounded man calling for help or direction. It was a man in the grip of pain that had temporarily erased everything else. The two soldiers immediately behind the first stopped, looked down at the stake protruding from the undergrowth, looked at the man screaming, looked at the wall of vegetation on all sides of them, and ran, not back to the trail, not south toward the entrance, north, deeper into the funnel, along the eastern wall of the outcropping, moving fast and without formation, in exactly the direction of the second and third traps. The second trap triggered at 6:48 a.m. and 40 seconds. Another man down. Another voice added to the frequency of sound coming from the eastern undergrowth. The screaming changed the character of the situation completely and irreversibly. Until that moment, the first moment, the resonator moment, the patrol's fear had been a combat fear, disciplined, searching, oriented toward an enemy it was trying to locate and fix. A skilled unit can maintain cohesion through that fear for long enough to function. What the screaming introduced was different. The screaming meant that men were dying from something that had not been seen, had not been heard as a weapon, and could not be located by looking in the obvious directions. The screaming meant that the invisible threat had physical teeth. In the screaming, the specific register of it, the inability of either fallen man to shout words or directives, only the pure sound of extremity, activated a response in the soldiers clustered in the funnel that years of training is slow to fully override, the deep bilateral impulse to move away from the source of a sound that means death. The column broke. Not simultaneously. Military units do not break simultaneously. They break in cascades. The front of the column went first, the men nearest the screaming who had seen both soldiers fall without any visible cause. They moved north along the trail, then off the trail to the west, away from the outcropping, away from the screaming, away from anything that had defined their formation 10 seconds earlier. The machine gun team, rising from prone without the weapon, without the tripod, without the ammunition pack, followed the front element west. The Type 96 remained in the mud of the trail, bipod deployed, pointing at nothing. The middle section of the column followed when the front section moved, the way water follows the first crack in a levee. Monoline watched 15 men exit the trail to the western side, into the drainage ravine margin, a zone of soft earth and exposed roots from which, as he knew from months of movement through it, there was no fast exit. Several would spend hours working their way back to elevation. Several others would not manage it before dark. The rear section held for approximately 12 seconds after the middle section broke. Then the third bamboo trap triggered, somewhere in the undergrowth to the north, and a third scream joined the other two. The rear section dissolved in 3 seconds. The column commander was the last man standing in the funnel. Monolang could see him clearly, standing at the trail's center, shouting into the empty space where his unit had been 30 seconds earlier. He turned in a full circle, methodically. He looked at the trail to the south, the entrance. He looked at the machine gun lying in the mud. He looked at the undergrowth to the east, where the screaming had started. He looked north, where his men had gone. He looked at the mist still hanging in the canopy. Then Lieutenant Takeshi Inoue, as his name would later be confirmed from captured garrison records, turned south. He walked, not ran, toward the entrance of the funnel with the specific mechanical gait of a man who has absorbed more information than his mind can currently process. He did not look back. He walked out of the funnel at 6:53 a.m. He was the only man in the 43-man patrol who left it walking. Inside the undergrowth to the east, 2 soldiers were dead from the spring traps. One was dying. The rest of the patrol, those who had not followed Inoue south, had scattered into the jungle in at least 4 directions, none of which led back to the Santa Cruz garrison by any direct route. Several were moving north, deeper into guerrilla-held terrain. Several others had descended into the drainage ravine and could not easily get out. The Type 96 light machine gun, its ammunition, and its tripod remained in the trail mud where the crew had abandoned them. Corporal Santos's 6-man covering element, 230 meters to the east, had heard the resonators. They had heard the spring traps. They had heard the screaming and the running and the prolonged silence that followed. Santos's field report, written 3 days later, described his initial assessment as certainty that a large firefight had begun and that Manolang was dead. He ordered his element to hold position. At 7:02 a.m., the jungle went quiet. At 7:08 a.m., Rodrigo Manolang walked out of the fern cluster and up the slope toward the covering position. carrying his exercise book under his arm and the vine trigger string coiled over his shoulder like a farmer returning from his field. Santos stared at him. Manalang said, "The corridor is clear, Corporal." A long pause. "What happened down there?" Santos asked. Manalang looked back at the funnel below the ridgeline. Where the mist was beginning to lift, the morning light was finding the canopy. "The jungle spoke," he said. "The corridor was used that same day." By 10 a.m. on March 14th, Santos's covering element had been reorganized into a movement relay team, and the first transfer of the quinine cache had begun through the Nagaland funnel. The 3 malaria patients in the interior shelter received their first proper dose of treatment before sunset. None of them died. Lieutenant Villanueva debriefed Manalang formally on March 15th. The debrief lasted 3 hours. Villanueva said nothing critical. He asked technical questions about the burial angles, the bind string tension specifications, the spring trap placements, the acoustic behavior of the resonator network under different wind and humidity conditions. He asked how Manalang had predicted the patrol's eastern break rather than a western one. Manalang opened his exercise book to the observation records and walked his commanding officer through each entry. Villanueva read every page of the book. He asked to keep it overnight and returned it the following morning. On March 17th, Villanueva wrote a formal recommendation to the Marking Guerrilla's command structure, proposing that Manalang's acoustic deception system be documented, studied, and adapted for deployment in other corridor defense situations across the Quezon Laguna operational area. He also recommended Manalang's promotion to corporal, citing demonstrated tactical innovation and individual initiative under conditions of command ambiguity. The recommendations were approved within 2 weeks. The operational impact extended beyond the Nagaland corridor. Over the following 4 months, modified versions of the resonator system were deployed in 3 other guerrilla operational zones in the border region. None of the subsequent deployments precisely replicated the conditions of March 14th, but all 3 produced measurable results: disrupted Japanese patrol formations, extended Japanese dwell times in cleared zones, and in one documented case, the voluntary abandonment of a Japanese observation post whose 2-man garrison filed a report citing persistent, unusual acoustic activity consistent with large guerrilla movement, when, in fact, a single fighter with 2 carabao horns and a length of vine had been the only presence in the area. The recovered Santa Cruz garrison records told the other half of the story. Lieutenant Inoue filed a combat report upon reaching the garrison on the afternoon of March 14th. According to post-war American intelligence analysis of captured Japanese documents, his report described the incident as an ambush by a large guerrilla force using unknown automatic weapons deployed in concealed positions on both sides of the trail. The garrison commander dispatched a 20-man recovery team, which entered the corridor at dawn on March 15th, recovered the dead and the abandoned Type 96 machine gun, and found 17 small holes in the earth near the trail's edge, each one containing a carved carabao horn. The recovery team's report noted the objects, classified them as unknown devices of probable agricultural origin, and did not connect them to the ambush. The garrison reclassified the Nagaland corridor as a high-intensity ambush zone and permanently rerouted all patrol activity away from it. The corridor was never contested again. Rodrigo Manalang survived the war. He was promoted to sergeant before the liberation of Luzon in 1945 and served in active resistance operations until the formal conclusion of organized guerrilla activity in August of that year. He returned to San Isidro, Laguna in September 1945, resumed farming, married a schoolteacher named Consolacion in 1947, and raised 4 children. He died in 1981 at the age of 61, from causes his family described simply as the accumulated wear of a life lived hard and early. He is buried in the municipal cemetery of San Pedro, Laguna. He received the Philippine Liberation Medal and a collective unit citation as a recognized member of the Marking Guerrillas. He was never individually decorated for the events of March 14, 1944, in part because the classified tactical value of the resonator system, which American military intelligence advisors had studied in detail during the occupation's final year, meant that operational records associated with it remained restricted for more than a decade after the war's end. When the Lukban schoolhouse records were recovered and declassified by the Philippine Army's Historical Section in 1962, a retired American intelligence officer reviewing the documentation wrote a single sentence in the margin beside Villanueva's debrief transcription: "This man should have been a general. He was never promoted beyond sergeant-tyrant. His technique was simple, but his legend endures.